how should organizations go about getting visibility over their attack surface?
Uh, Again, that's the fundamental step here is knowing the unknowns, what's out there, what you don't know. So understanding your assets, and that's where security starts for every organization. What hardware, what software, what data do you have? Where's it at? Is it on-premise in the cloud? What is under your control? What is under your vendor control? And I think, the primary focus, at least in the financial industry, is knowing where your data is, where it's going, and who's controlling it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those unknowns you mentioned are really an issue, because what you don't know, again, what you can't see, you can't protect. So in years past, perhaps securing a perimeter was almost solely a question of internal assets, servers, endpoints, etc. And while that approach made sense 20 years ago, organizations have so many more external facing assets today, which are largely what make up that group of unknowns. So those external assets, they introduce new levels of risk to the organization. How do you account for all that makes up an attack surface today?
I think the thing to remember with this is to start simple and expand and enhance as you grow. If you're focused on, I need this complete list now, it can be a little overwhelming. So start with those things and then grow from there. And remember, your environment's constantly changing, so it's something you're going to be doing forever. It's ongoing. So build discovery into your environment, knowing, using different tools and methods, looking at different types of scans, whether they be IP scans or SNMP scans, authenticated, unauthenticated. Create a complete change management database. Have that repository where all your assets are in. You know where to go. Get that data normalized from multiple sources. Give you a really good picture of what's out there. And then have an accurate infrastructure map that helps you visualize the business services involved. Not just the systems, but the data, what types of encryption, anything that helps you identify how that data is moving from point A to point B.
All great points. Yeah, I think the service map is a really interesting point, because that's how you start tying things together. It's not all just these lone assets out there existing in a vacuum. It brings the whole picture together. So that covers off on visibility, which again is really the foundation for so much of IT and cybersecurity, and especially this exposure management story. And it leads us to our next area of discussion here, which is prioritization. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't really worry so much about prioritization, right? We'd remediate every single exposure and therefore eliminate every single threat. As we all know, though, here in the real world, that's simply not feasible. So then it becomes this calculation that every organization has to make. What's our risk appetite, if you will? What's the level of risk that's acceptable to us? Robert, how have you looked at that calculation throughout your career, and how do you look at it today?
You covered a little bit about this early on. A number of years ago, infrastructure was simpler. Your connection points to the internet, if they existed, were very minimal. Most people were in an office. You could kind of control that environment. You might have had one or two vendors that had some stuff off premise, like, for example, a core banking system, things like that. And obviously, we've seen it expand exponentially. And you had a list early on where you could say, hey, you need to do these 5 things. And that was kind of the all-encompassing list you had to use. But now that list doesn't work. That's a good starting spot, but you got to go further. And just like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a continued process improvement cycle. Once you think you're done, you're not. Something else is going to get added to that environment. You just need to make sure you add it back in or add that into it. And I think you mentioned risk appetite. I think risk appetite is obviously a very integral part of security. It needs to be determined by the organization. Sometimes IT departments will kind of want to derive that themselves, but that's a business function. And I think you need to sit down with your business units, strategize with them, talk to them, train them, show them what the cyber side or the information security side of risk is and how you can help mitigate risk, and just kind of guide them through that process. Everybody talks about IT or cybersecurity being a department of no. I like to really think of it more of the department of how.
That's a great quote. Yeah, Department of No has been the long time, perhaps fair or unfair, label that's been slapped on cybersecurity. But Department of How is so key in this day and age. I mean, it's all about enabling the business. And I have a specific experience I remember from my career, going back several years now. And I work in marketing, like I said, and this was at a previous company. But we were looking to enable, I think, some sort of widget or something to do with Salesforce, some sort of Salesforce plugin. And for whatever reason, the head of our IT and security team felt that it introduced, a vulnerability or risk, rather, to the organization at a level he wasn't comfortable with. But it was pretty critical to the business side that they had this plugin activated. And I literally sat at a table with, the head of our sales ops team on one side and the head of IT and security at the other, with her pleading her case to enable this plugin. And he was pretty much just stone-faced, just, very few words, but most of them were just no. And hence the Department of No label. Instead of having that Department of How conversation around, how do we make this happen for the organization so that it allows the organization to operate how it needs to grow or attain whatever other goals it feels are applicable, and also protect itself at the same time. So that is really the conversation around risk appetite. You talked a little bit about this, but, if I could pry a little more, how might you advise others in your position make the calculation on risk appetite, and what are the main things to take into account?
I think obviously, like I mentioned, it's business risk. So involve the business managers, let them kind of figure out what they can and can't work with. And then you find the controls to do that. But I think underlying, you need to kind of understand a little bit about the scoring that you're using, the measurements, whether it's CVSS, works as good as a base, but it doesn't represent the risk. It just represents the security aspect of it. And you need to understand what the impact is to the system. And I think knowing that will help you a lot. And then also knowing and understanding likelihood and impact along with that is, what's the likelihood of this event happening? And then what's the impact? There's, in the banking world, as in any other business unit or business, there's, monetary loss, there's customer dissatisfaction, there's reputation. You need to understand those impacts to what's going to happen with this particular event in order to make a really good assessment of what you need to do from a risk management perspective.
Absolutely. You touched on a lot of great points there, and I'm going to try to hit on a few of them one by one. Scoring, CVSS, the impact that kind of gets into the validation conversation. So we're going to cover off on all that. And you started off talking about the scoring and incorporating the risk. And that is really, I think, touching on the idea of risk-based vulnerability management, or RBVM, which again is, CVSS. And I mentioned this at the top on the primer slide. CVSS is a great place to start, and it's a great base, and it's definitely relevant to this prioritization discussion, but it measures that severity, but not risk. So it's, again, how easily a vulnerability could be exploited, but not whether it actually has. It doesn't reflect that real world risk. So risk-based vulnerability management was sort of the first step in that conversation around, okay, how do we bring that risk into the conversation and use it to guide our prioritization decisions? But then you touched on some other parts, which is where we're starting to see exposure management go, which is from vulnerability management to RBVM, now to exposure management, which is bringing in that business context. And that's, okay, sure, this vulnerability, according to, RBVM or whatever scoring you may be using, has a high level of risk. It's been exploited. It may be associated with remote remote control execution or privilege escalation or ransomware or any of these threats. And that's definitely something to be cognizant of, but what's the business context? So, if we're seeing this vulnerability on some, device that's not even connecting to the internet, it's inaccessible, the level of risk perhaps for the business is much lower than if it's on your server that's hosting your e-commerce website.
Yes.
So that's where we're really seeing this progression from, again, that traditional vulnerability management into exposure management, where we're starting to account for this business context. And it's definitely in early stages. It's in, the early days, if you will, of that conversation and exposure management overall. So what we've seen with risk-based vulnerability management is assigning criticality to assets, where you're able to go in and say, okay, this asset is a 5. Any vulnerability on this asset is a major issue. We need to remediate it right away. Or it could be a 1, whatever that scale is. A 1 is low. We're not too worried about it. So that's where we're at with like the RBVM stage, which is now transitioning to this exposure management stage, where you're looking more at the actual business impact. So that's just kind of a back of the napkin assessment. Yeah, this server's a 5, this one's a 1. Trying to get to that point to where you're seeing, all right, if this exposure were to be exploited on this asset, what is the actual, dollar value impact to the organization, that sort of thing. So that's where we're going, really. And, just another piece of that conversation is the scoring systems that you mentioned. So as long as we're talking about risk appetite, it's worth asking, how should organizations go about gauging risk in the first place? And what does a good process using the right scoring systems look like to you?
Good question. I think you've kind of highlighted a few things there. I think obviously understanding the risk the vulnerability poses to your organization helps you determine the priority and the controls to mitigate that risk. You can look at something that has a relatively high CVSS, but limited exposure, like you mentioned, or you might have a low exposure that is susceptible to a ransomware attack. So you've got to really look at the big picture. Don't get focused on, I got to take care of all my high CVSS scores, because you want to watch those low ones as well. And I think, as you mentioned with risk-based vulnerability management, it helps you focus on those. That's when you're looking at what's the greatest risk to the organization. And I think that's most important. And again, I think that partnership with the business is very important, because there's certain things, certain systems, certain data that they need that just because of what it does, it's going to be, as you mentioned, risk rated a little bit higher. So you got to sit down with them, develop that big picture. And I think that carries forward too. As you're doing that process, you're going to find that's a good intro to your business continuity plan as well.